Hello and welcome to another TLDR Brexit Explained video. So, over the last week, all we've heard about is the US election. But this isn't to say that other things haven't happened. While Joe Biden's electoral victory is being widely reported on, many other things have slipped under the radar. For example, the progress of the Internal Markets Bill. Something that, shameless plug, we did report on in This Week in Parliament a couple of weeks ago. That's exclusively on the TLDR Daily channel, and there's a link to subscribe down below. Anyway, yesterday the bill, which is fundamental to Johnson's Brexit plan, went through the House of Lords for the committee stage, which is basically the part where the bill receives line-by-line scrutiny. So in this video, we're going to explain what happened in the debate, what the Lords' objections to the bill is, because spoilers, they're not a big fan of it, and where the bill and Brexit plans go from here. If you're watching a video about Brexit in the Lords, you're probably pretty into politics and Brexit. If that's you, then you might appreciate our new book, Brexit the Colouring Book. Our brand new expanded edition colouring book features 21 pictures, taking you through the Brexit timeline, from Cameron announcing the referendum to the EU summit a few weeks ago. Read through our summary of the whole story and colour along with our brand new book. Anyway, you can pre-order now by clicking the link in the description, and you can get yourself 20% off if you use the code LORDS. So let's start off by briefly explaining what the Internal Market Bill is and why it's caused such a fuss over the last few weeks. Put simply, the UK is trying to override the withdrawal agreement. This is the agreement that was signed by both the UK and EU and sets out the framework for how the UK leaves the EU and what sort of relationship will remain between the two upon its departure. The part that it's trying to override is the part that deals with how goods travel between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And that's because the government has long said that there'll be no checks on items moving between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. This would mean that goods could move freely between the two, and this would maintain the integrity of the United Kingdom. However, the government appears to have recently realised that despite what they've been saying, the withdrawal agreement doesn't actually say that goods can freely move throughout the United Kingdom without customs checks. In fact, it says the exact opposite, requiring checks on goods that cross the Irish Sea. So the government did what it felt necessary to resolve the issue, and break the terms of the withdrawal agreement and international law. It did this by trying to pass the Internal Market Bill, which grants the UK power to unilaterally determine how goods cross the Irish Sea. Under such an agreement, the EU would not have any say, in direct contradiction to the withdrawal agreement. So, very briefly, this is what the Internal Market Bill is. The reason it's a bill is that it hasn't yet passed into law, which would obviously turn it into the Internal Market Act. Some of you might be scratching your heads about this and thinking, didn't this already pass into law? That's likely because it was a big news story a few weeks ago, when the Internal Market Bill passed through the House of Commons, despite backbench opposition from within the Conservative Party, with 2 Conservatives voting against it and as many as 30 abstaining. The reason this is being brought up again is because of the often forgotten about House of Lords. This chamber isn't there just as a topic of argument about constitutional reform. It has powers and roles to play in the creation of legislation. While the bill appears to have completed its journey through the Commons, it now has to clear the House of Lords too. In fact, they already cleared the first and second readings in the House of Lords, though it should be noting that while it did clear those stages, the House of Lords can't actually block legislation, so it was always going to pass them. The power the Lords has instead is to table a motion of regret, which incidentally is exactly what the House of Lords did during the second reading. Lord Judge tabled this motion. Specifically, this House regrets that Part 5 of the bill contains provisions which, if enacted, would undermine the rule of law and damage the reputation of the United Kingdom.
Over 8 hours, we heard the bill broken down into 3 areas of serious concern: its illegality, its threat to the Union, and its structural limitations. The analysis of the noble and learned Lord Judge, backed up by many other legal peers, was clear. This bill establishes a position whereby the UK breaks international law.
In the end, this motion of regret was voted for by 395 peers, and against by 169. Members of all parties, including the Conservatives, voted for this motion, while only Conservatives and Independents voted against it. But despite this vote, the bill will move on to the committee stage in the House of Lords, where the bill will be analysed line by line and agreements will be tabled. If the House of Lords agrees on an amendment to the bill, then this will need to be signed off by the House of Commons too, in a process known as parliamentary ping-pong, because both sides need to agree to the same text. Due to the Lords knowing that they're the subservient of the two houses, they're usually unlikely to start a dispute with the Commons. But assuming the Lords aren't focusing too much on the survival of their workplace, what happens if they decide they do want to stand up to the Commons? What if they double down on their opposition to this part of the Internal Markets Bill, which overrides the withdrawal agreement? Well, the only real power that the Lords would have in this situation is to delay the legislation. Due to the Parliament Act of 1949, the House of Lords can delay legislation by up to 1 year, but they don't have the power to outright veto a bill. However, back onto topic, some of you might be thinking how this works in relation to the Internal Markets Bill, because a delay in this legislation would kind of mean killing it off entirely. That's because the UK is set to leave the remaining institutions of the EU at the end of this year. A delay in the Lords would render this bill useless, and certainly amplify feelings within the Conservative Party that something needs to be done about the House of Lords. Anyway, so this is what could have happened. Real emphasis on could there. This is more like the plot of a third-rate political drama, if we're being honest. But what exactly did happen? To start with, the government made clear that if the House of Lords amended the bill and removed any of the key elements, then the government would simply reinstate it when the bill came back to the Commons. If the Lords truly wanted to remove it, then the Lords would have to go toe-to-toe with the Commons, something that could end very, very badly for the Lords. Nonetheless, the debate opened with Lord Judge stating that he intended to put each clause of the controversial part of the Internal Market Bill before the Lords, in the hope that they would vote that they are not content with the inclusion of the bill.
The question is that Clause 42 stand part of the bill. Lord Judge.
My Lords, it is only 3 weeks since an overwhelming majority of this House regretted Part 5 of the bill. We regretted that the enactment of Part 5 would undermine the rule of law and damage our international reputation. Our procedures do not, however, permit us now to record that we are not content that Part 5 should stand part of the bill. We must address the question, clause by clause, of allowing the sovereignty of Parliament to be refashioned into the sovereignty of the executive. My Lords, in this part, the executive is seeking powers that Parliament should never have been asked to give. But as we have been asked to give them, we must not be complicit. We must not be supine. And the only way available to us to indicate that we are neither complicit nor supine is for us to say not content to each clause in this part of the bill.
Shortly after, the Conservative peer Lord Howard of Limp spoke. Although he sat on the Conservative benches, he was far from complimentary to the government.
Both in your Lordship's House and elsewhere, is to seek to make the case that circumstances make it expedient to break international law. But, my Lords, isn't that what lawbreakers always say? Isn't that the excuse of lawbreakers everywhere? What sort of a precedent is the government setting when it admits that position? Every clause in Part 5 of the bill seeks to interpret, if one's being kind, or to displace, if one's being accurate, the provisions of the Northern Ireland Protocol of the Withdrawal Agreement, an agreement, I need hardly remind your Lordships, which this government signed barely a year ago.
In fact, even the Archbishop of Canterbury registered his opposition to the fact that the bill breaks international law.
At second reading, I stated that the primary purpose of this House is to amend and improve legislation, not to derail it. But I believe that I was wrong in saying that. There is an even more primary function, which the noble Lord Howard set out very clearly. It is to defend the rule of law and to protect the balances of power and peace in our union.
Not only did the Archbishop register his opposition, Lord Clerk of Nottingham also gave a very powerful speech against the bill.
If I think I've already made it quite clear, I would find it absolutely unbelievable if such a piece of legislation found its way to the statute book. I've served in government, in cabinets for many years. No government I served in would have contemplated for one moment presenting a bill of this kind. It would have been rejected instantly as incompatible with the way we govern this country. So therefore it's the duty of this House actually to reject it.
Some Lords did try to defend Section 5, the controversial part and the part that breaks international law, by saying that international law is different and that it is only upheld if countries are treated fairly. This was the argument of Conservative peer Lord Moylan.
This is not a legal point, it's a point in the philosophy of law, and it's highly contestable. International law is a distinct realm, a realm in which practical relations between states are codified, but which do not endure if they place intolerable burdens on one party.
So what happened after the debates? Well, the Lords voted 433 to 165 to amend the Internal Markets Bill and remove Section 5. This makes the Internal Markets Bill something far, far different from what ministers initially intended. This is a clear sign that not only do the Lords disapprove of the IMB, but they also want to take action to change it. The problem for them, though, is that, as we mentioned earlier, the government is now able to insert their own amendment reinstating Article 5, knowing that in constitutional terms, the House of Commons trumps the House of Lords. In fact, this is exactly what they plan to do, with the government remarking after the vote, "We are disappointed that the House of Lords has voted to remove clauses. We will retable the clauses when the bill returns to the Commons." While it's possible for the Lords to delay the legislation for a maximum of a year by insisting on the amendment, the Commons rejecting it, and a double insistence taking place, it's highly unlikely to do so, and the government will likely still get their way. This means that the government can carry on with their plan for Brexit, and attempt to get a deal with the EU, supposedly, but if not, trade with them under WTO terms, and allowing goods to flow from Great Britain to Northern Ireland unencumbered, thanks to this bill, albeit breaking international law in the process. However, the House of Lords has now registered their opposition, and whether in a political show of force, the House of Lords decides to reject the Commons' amendments again, delaying the bill for a year, is still yet to be seen. If this does happen, then we're truly in uncharted territory. The government would likely amend the IMB slightly, and then try and reintroduce it as new legislation, similar to Theresa May's multiple Brexit deals. But again, who knows what would happen? As we've already seen, no one can predict what's going to happen in 2020. Anyway, let us know what you think will happen next in the comments below. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so that we can update you on the Brexit situation as this rather crazy year closes out. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then be sure to back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.